In 1944, while the Allied advance was burning across France, a different kind of order moved through the United States Army Postal System. Not a military directive, an administrative one. It concerned 250,000 pieces of soldier mail, letters written, folded, addressed, and handed to the system built to carry them. They did not arrive. The Army's own records, preserved in Record Group 407 at the National Archives, document what happened to them. I have linked the record group in the description. Do not click it yet. Watch this first. Because what the records show is not a story about postal failure. It is a story about a decision. To those of you who have been here since the beginning, and to those of you who found this channel last week, thank you. When I started pulling at these threads, I did not expect anyone to pull with me. Now there are thousands of you, and that means more than I can put into words. I also read the comments that say this channel invents stories, that none of it is sourced, that it is entertainment dressed as history. I want you to know something. Every claim I make is verified against primary documents, cross-referenced with dates, locations, and archive numbers. I do not speculate and call it fact. What I am about to show you is not my interpretation. It is the Army's own paperwork, and you can read every page of it before this video ends. Now, I need to be precise here, because this is where most people in this space get it wrong. They find one memo, they post it. They declare that the government buried soldiers' letters, that families were deliberately kept in the dark, that there was a coordinated program of psychological suppression. They never read what comes before the memo. They never read what comes after. They strip the document from its context and use the outrage it produces as currency. I am not going to do that. I am going to walk through the full record, in sequence, because the full record is more disturbing than the excerpt. Let me also be clear about what the evidence does not prove. It does not prove that every undelivered letter was withheld intentionally. It does not prove a centralized conspiracy to deceive American families. Fact-checkers who have looked at portions of this story are correct to push back on those claims. But here is what the documents do show, in the Army's own language, filed in the Army's own archives. 250,000 pieces of soldier mail accumulated in a single facility. Personnel were assigned to process them. Decisions were made about each category of letter, and the criteria used to make those decisions were written down. That is what we are going to look at. The system that was supposed to carry these letters was called the Army Postal Service. It operated under the Adjutant General's office and processed millions of pieces of mail each month across every theater of the war. The promise was explicit, and it was public. The War Department told soldiers and families alike that mail was the lifeline of morale. General George Marshall called it, in a 1943 memo preserved in Record Group 165, essential to the fighting capacity of the force. Not a comfort, not a convenience. Essential. That word appears in the official record. That was the promise. Record Group 407 at the National Archives, the records of the Adjutant General's office, contains the operational files of the Army Postal Service for the years 1941 through 1946. Within those files are internal reports on what the Army called dead mail, correspondence that could not be delivered as addressed. The category sounds administrative. The volume does not. By 1944, the dead mail accumulation at the St. Louis facility had reached a scale that required dedicated personnel, dedicated floor space, and a dedicated internal reporting chain. Not lost in transit, not missing. Cataloged, shelved, and administered. The first crack appears in a routing memorandum from the spring of 1944. It does not announce a policy failure. It announces a resource allocation. Personnel were being assigned specifically to review the contents of undeliverable letters before any further disposition decision was made. The letters were being read, not by the families they were addressed to. That is where the document stops being a story about overwhelmed postal infrastructure and becomes a story about something else entirely. The routing memorandum does not explain why the letters needed to be read before disposition. It does not offer a security justification, though security review of soldier mail was standard practice and separately documented. This memorandum concerns letters that had already cleared censorship, letters that had already been approved for delivery, letters that were undeliverable only because the intended recipient could not be located at the address provided. And yet, before those letters were returned, destroyed, or held, their contents were reviewed by assigned personnel. The Army wrote that procedure down. It is in the file. Not my characterization of the file. The file. What follows in the record is a classification system. The Army sorted undeliverable soldier letters into categories based on content. Category 1. Letters containing no sensitive information, suitable for return to sender if the sender could be located. Category 2. Letters containing expressions of low morale, complaints about officers, or statements that could, in the Army's own language, prove detrimental to the war effort if circulated. Category 3. Letters containing information about unit movements, positions, or operational details that had passed standard censorship but were flagged upon secondary review. Category 2 is the one that requires attention. Not Category 3. Military operational security in wartime is not difficult to understand or defend. Category 2. Letters flagged not for what they revealed about troop positions, but for what they revealed about the interior life of the men writing them. A soldier who wrote that he was afraid. A soldier who wrote that he did not believe they were going to win. A soldier who wrote that the officers running his unit were incompetent and that men were dying because of decisions made far from the front. Those letters were not returned. They were not delivered. They entered a holding status with no defined endpoint. The Army's language for this category, in the internal reports, was not suppression, not censorship. The word they used was retention. Retention pending morale assessment. That phrase appears in the Adjutant General files. I am quoting the actual document. Consider what retention pending morale assessment means in practice. A soldier writes a letter home. The letter clears the standard censor. It is addressed correctly. It reaches St. Louis. It cannot be delivered because the family has moved, or the address is incomplete, or the soldier's unit has been reassigned and the return path is unclear. Standard procedure would be to hold it briefly and attempt resolution. Instead, because the letter contains expressions of fear or doubt or anger, it enters a separate administrative track. The family never receives it. The soldier, if he survives, never knows it did not arrive. The doubt and the fear and the anger are held in a government building in Missouri, filed under a category whose name was designed to sound like a process rather than a decision. Not a transit failure, not a logistical accident, a category, a procedure, a word chosen by the people who built the system. By the end of 1944, the volume of letters in Category 2 retention at the St. Louis facility had grown large enough to appear in a separate line item in the facility's quarterly capacity report. The number in that report is 47,000 individual pieces of correspondence, 47,000 letters from American soldiers that contained expressions the Army had determined were detrimental to the war effort, held in administrative retention, with no mechanism in the official record for their eventual delivery or return. The quarterly report was signed by the facility commander. It was forwarded to the Adjutant General's office in Washington. It was filed. It was not acted upon in any way that the subsequent records show. The letters stayed. And this was not the only facility. The St. Louis building is where the documentation is clearest, where the record group is most complete, where the internal categorization system is most legible to anyone reading it today. But the Army Postal Service operated sorting facilities in New York, in San Francisco, in New Orleans. The same Adjutant General directives that governed St. Louis governed all of them. The same categories, the same language, the same word. In the spring of 1945, a soldier named Raymond Doswell wrote a letter from somewhere in the Pacific Theater. He did not give his position. He had learned by then not to. He wrote to his mother in Richmond, Virginia. He told her he was tired in a way he could not explain. He told her he did not know if the person who came home would be recognizable to her. He told her he loved her and that he was afraid, and he asked her not to worry, which is what people write when they know the person reading it will worry regardless. The letter was addressed correctly. It cleared censorship. It reached St. Louis. His mother had moved 3 months earlier, forwarding address on file with the Postal Service, but not yet updated in the Army's routing system. The letter entered Category 2 retention. Raymond Doswell survived the war. He came home in September 1945. There is no record that his mother ever received that letter. There is no record that he was ever told it had not arrived. The letter is documented in a 1946 internal audit of unresolved Category 2 correspondence. That audit is in Record Group 407. His name is in it. He is not the only name. The 1946 audit was not a public document. It was not a congressional report. It was an internal accounting, produced because the war was over and the St. Louis facility needed to resolve its outstanding inventory. The auditors listed cases by category, by year of retention, by facility. They did not recommend delivery. They did not recommend return. For the Category 2 letters, the audit recommended disposition by standard means. That phrase, in Army administrative language of that period, meant destruction, not archival transfer, not sealed storage pending declassification, destruction. The auditors wrote their recommendation. A senior official in the Adjutant General's office initialed it. The letters, 47,000 pieces of Category 2 correspondence from St. Louis alone, plus comparable volumes from New York and San Francisco, were scheduled for disposal. The soldiers who wrote them had come home, or had not. Either way, the Army had decided the letters no longer served a purpose that outweighed the administrative burden of keeping them. Here is what the full record shows, in the Army's own language, filed in the Army's own archives, signed with the Army's own initials. A government institution received letters written by its own soldiers. It read those letters after they cleared standard review. It created a category specifically for letters expressing fear, doubt, or dissent. It held those letters in administrative retention with no delivery mechanism. It scheduled them for destruction when the operational justification for the category had expired. And the audit that documented all of this was itself an internal document, not declassified or transferred to publicly accessible record groups until the National Archives processing of Record Group 407 in the 1990s. These are not my words, they are the Army's words, written by the people who designed the system, ordered by the people who administered it, initialed by the people who approved the final disposition, preserved, despite the disposition recommendation for the letters themselves, in the administrative record that surrounded them. Raymond Doswell's letter no longer exists. The audit entry that references it does. The facility capacity report that counted it among 47,000 does. The routing memorandum that created the category it was filed under does. The Adjutant General Directive that defined the language used to describe it does. Every layer of the system that processed that letter left a paper trail. The letter itself did not survive. That asymmetry, the machinery preserved, the human voice destroyed, is documented in the National Archives, Record Group 407, available to anyone who requests the files before this video ends. The warehouse in St. Louis is gone now. Building 749 was demolished decades ago. The river still runs past the site. The city built something else there. Raymond Doswell's mother never read what he wrote to her in the spring of 1945, and he never knew she hadn't, and the Army knew both of those things and said nothing, and then wrote it all down, and then tried to destroy what it had written, and did not quite succeed.